What does sound look like to you? That's right. I asked what sound looks like to you. I see colors when I hear sounds, and you might too, without even realizing it. I'll say that again. I see colors when I hear sounds, and you might too, without even realizing it. I'll explain what I mean. My name is Sarah, and I'm an abstract artist with a background in neuropsychology research. I've also lived with a trait called synesthesia my entire life. Synesthesia is a crossing of the senses that causes one sense, like sight, smell, or hearing, to be triggered by another separate sense. My synesthesia causes me to experience sounds as colors, patterns, textures, and movement. These experiences are consistent and automatic, meaning that a sound looks the same way to me each time I hear it. And synesthesia is actually more common than you might realize. Researchers estimate that around 2 to 5% of the world has synesthesia. To put that number into perspective, that's more common than being born with red hair. For something that's this common, you'd think a lot of people would have heard about it before. But many synesthetes, myself included, have felt isolated and like we need to keep this trait to ourselves. So why is this? When I was little, I assumed everyone saw the world the way I did. To me, the colors and sound were just another sense, like sight or hearing. The red ribbons in violins were as real to me as the crayons I used to draw them. But when I tell others about the colors of sounds, I was often met with blank stares, comments about my big imagination, or laughter. Still, I didn't think to ask if people saw the world the way I did. It almost seemed like a silly question, like asking if they too could see that roses were red. But then one day, when I was about 7 years old, I asked my mom what she thought about the sparkles in the chimes of my favorite Disney song. And I was shocked when she told me she saw nothing at all. She didn't tease me, but I knew from her reaction that something was different about me. After many similar reactions from other people, I began wondering if there was actually just something wrong with me. And so, by the time I was 9 years old, I stopped talking about these experiences altogether. Even still, the colors of sound caused me new problems as I grew older. School was a nightmare. Every chair scraping across the floor was a bright flash of light. The kids chatting were little dots of color, and my teacher's voice was like a scratchy orange ribbon. The world sometimes felt like it was assaulting me with color and noise, and I was desperate to find relief. Then, to make matters worse, my teachers started playing classical music at test time, thinking it would help us relax and test better. But for me, the colors of the instruments distracted me. Imagine you're sitting in the middle of Times Square, honking cars, flashing lights, and squealing tires all around you. Now, imagine someone hands you a pencil and asks you to take a math test. That was what a typical school day felt like for me. I would turn in half-completed tests and assignments, even though I knew the material. My teachers could tell that I was sound sensitive, but they didn't know why. So I was pulled out of class, again and again and again, for testing, as the adults in my life tried to figure out what was going on in my brain. I was tested for ADHD, autism, and auditory processing disorder. I was even checked for oppositional defiant disorder, in case I was just choosing not to focus. But test after test came back negative, and without a formal diagnosis, my school couldn't offer much help. My parents fought to get me accommodations anyway, like testing in a private, separate room, but for the most part, I was left to navigate this loud and colorful world on my own. The confusion of the adults made me wonder if I was just broken or weak somehow. After all, they were supposed to know more than I did. But my childhood experiences are not uncommon. Synesthesia is missed and misdiagnosed for many different reasons. One of these might be that, up until relatively recently, researchers themselves thought synesthesia was much rarer than we understand it to be now. The reports of synesthetes were frequently disbelieved or were chalked up to mental health conditions, such as schizophrenia. Thankfully, with the introduction of brain imaging into research in the 70s and 80s, researchers could finally visualize these sensory connections that synesthetes had always described. Unfortunately, though, the rest of the world's population hasn't yet caught up to this research. And while testing does now exist for synesthesia, there's only one standardized assessment for it to date, the synesthesia battery. This test is less than a couple decades old and is most often used in research rather than in educational or in medical settings. And lastly, due to the stigma of the trait, many synesthetes, like me, choose to keep it to themselves, further contributing to the misconception that it's extremely rare. However, after a couple decades of keeping the trait to myself, I had my breakthrough. In college, my studies focused on neuroscience and psychology, and it was there that I learned information that would change my life. In a class called Abnormal Psychology, I learned not only that my experiences were valid, but that they had a name: synesthesia. I also learned that synesthesia may not be so abnormal after all. Remember, it's believed to be more common than having red hair. I learned that there are over 80 different types of synesthesia that have been identified to date. Senses can be crossed in so many different ways. Many people have one of these types and don't even realize it because to them, these experiences are normal. Do you relate to any of the crossings on the screen? And while the exact cause of synesthesia isn't entirely understood, it's believed to be due to a hyperconnectivity of pathways in the brain. When we're born, we have more neural connections than we do as adults. But in the first few years of life, many of these connections are pruned away to make room for the most important ones. One theory suggests that perhaps everyone was born with synesthesia, but that these connections were just pruned away for most people, either partially or fully. Even if you don't have synesthesia, though, I bet you can relate to the concept of senses being linked. When we're feeling sad, we might also say we're feeling blue. Certain sounds can be described as smooth, rough, or sharp. One study explored how we might all link the concepts of color and shape to words. In the study, participants were shown two completely abstract shapes and were asked which shape is the word kiki and which is the word booba. There's no right or wrong answer, but most participants selected the same word shape combination anyway. When you look at these shapes, does one look like kiki and the other like booba? And even if you didn't know about synesthesia at all until today, you know of people who identify as synesthetes. Many artists have a form, using their linked senses to create their art. Billie Eilish, Billy Joel, Stevie Wonder, and Pharrell Williams are listed among this group. For me, art has also always been a way for me to express my senses. Growing up, I'd paint the colors that I saw in music, but I often kept these to myself. However, after learning more about my trait, I felt empowered to pick up my paintbrush again and start creating my own personal love letter to the beauty of sound. I even started sharing some of these paintings on social media. I didn't really expect many people to see them, but to my surprise, a lot of people resonated, not just with my paintings, but with my story. Thousands of comments flooded in from all over the world, and some posts were viewed millions of times. Other synesthetes were excited to find a community of others like them. Folks from the neurodivergent community chimed in and found similar experiences in lack of understanding in school and medical settings and overstimulation. And folks without synesthesia asked good questions, curious to see the world from different perspectives. The power of community cannot be overstated. Social isolation has been linked to higher rates of anxiety and depression, a 30% increased risk of heart disease, and a 50% increased risk of dementia. On the other hand, Having an accepting community has been associated with better mental and physical health outcomes. This was certainly true for me, as finding this community empowered me to continue sharing my experiences without fear. Not every comment was positive and uplifting, however. This is social media we're talking about, after all. Some people called me a liar, a fraud, or delusional. Others claimed I made up synesthesia for attention. And some even suggested I was a superhero, but somehow this still felt isolating, putting me in a box, separate from the world around me. Thankfully, the joy I had found in living more authentically gave me a resilience to these kinds of comments, but they still impacted me. I thought about the young people who felt represented by my story, perhaps seeing invalidation of their experiences for the first time. I thought about the adults in their 50s and 60s in my community who were sharing their trait for the first time in their life, saying that they finally felt safe to do so. And lastly, I thought about the people making these negative comments. How many of these people experienced synesthesia themselves, or knew someone who did, without even realizing it? How many of these people were cutting themselves off to an empowering understanding of their own lives simply by refusing to learn more? Statistically, there were probably quite a few. So why does this matter? And what can we do about it? Research has shown that those who feel empowered to live authentically are happier and more resilient. This was certainly true for me, as knowledge about myself enabled me to return to my passions and to live my life in fuller color. Openness about different ways of perceiving life encourages a world that's healthier, more authentic, and frankly, more interesting. I see colors when I hear sounds, and you might too. But if you don't, you probably know someone who does. By being open to all of the different colors of people's experiences, we can see more beauty in the world around us, and just maybe ourselves as well. Thank you.